Welcome to the very first episode of Let's Talk. I am Lacey Xepoleas, one of the current doctoral interns here at CAPS, and this is an effort to bring information to the Pacific community and also to connect and maybe, hopefully, bridge the gap on campus when it comes to mental health and what y'all are really dealing with. So today's first episode is going to be with Charlotte Felix, the registered dietitian here on campus. If you haven't already met Charlotte, she is fantastic. I highly recommend. Charlotte has a master's in nutritional sciences from the University of Washington. Since 2011, she's worked as a registered dietitian in a number of different settings, including HIV and infectious diseases, as well as mental health. Since her arrival here at UOP in 2018, she has been working with students in a variety of health spaces, including eating disorder recovery, sports nutrition, and gastrointestinal illnesses such as IBS. As a mom of two, Charlotte is eager to help young people learn healthy eating strategies to ensure optimal performance in their daily lives, as well as to help them lead long, healthy lives long after y'all have left UOP. So without further ado, let's jump in. Please note at the end of this episode, there will be some resources available. And if you are interested in connecting with Charlotte, you can either call Student Health Services or CAPS. We are happy to help connect. All right, let's do it. All right, Charlotte, oh my goodness, thank you so much for doing this with me in our effort to spread knowledge. I sound like another podcast person already. That's horrible. But our effort to spread knowledge across the campus, especially with topics that are so difficult to talk about. So first question, I think that will really help us set the stage on all the things, especially with this topic. What is the difference between having an eating disorder and experiencing disordered eating?
So they're very close. They basically live side by side, and it's just a question of severity and then frequency. So if somebody has an eating disorder, then they've checked boxes that live within that DSM criteria that classify them as having one of many now sort of classic eating disorder titles. And so there's a series of criteria that go under each of those. And so if someone's exhibiting a number of those and that qualify them to have the diagnosis, they may be diagnosed with an eating disorder. Regardless, if they've checked those boxes, they have an exhibit disordered eating. So that's kind of the difference, is that disordered eating is a behavioral sign and often will lead into an actual eating disorder. As far as counseling people, it's based on them and their comfort level. So if someone feels uncomfortable being sort of classified as something, then we just talk about the behavior itself rather than putting sort of a title on them as having an eating disorder. But it really boils down again to is it severe enough and frequent enough that it will allow that person to be classified as having an eating disorder. So that's the difference in semantics there.
That makes a ton of sense too, especially with like labeling. It can be so damaging or liberating. I mean, it really just depends.
Right, exactly.
So having said that, the difference in severity, the frequency, sort of the presentation, where do you think that some of these thoughts and feelings that are experienced around eating disorders and disordered eating come from?
So many places. So that really is such a big question, because we learn more and more about this as this is a huge area of research, not nearly as much research that should be going on. I mean, there's not as much financing as some of these chronic diseases out there, which is unfortunate because it really is one of the leading causes of death for mental illness. So it's a big issue. But yeah, we've learned some genetic factors that come into this. And then there's obviously the environmental ones. And then the environmental ones, there's so many that fall into that, meaning the environment of someone's home growing up, the environment in terms of culturally where they grew up, or just the culture of, again, their household. And that might just be, we might use that word culture as like, what is the culture of your home in general, but it also could quite literally mean someone's cultural background. And so definitely, especially at a school like UOP, we have a lot of international students. And so you can actually see trends in different cultures as far as what is praised, what is idealized. And while that might be something around academic performance, it can also be something like literally how someone's body looks, how it performs, weight specifically. I've seen that many times as far as parents checking in on someone's weight. Or it doesn't even have to be, and I'm sure we'll get into this with other questions, but it doesn't even have to be that the parents are necessarily checking in on the child's weight specifically, but that they themselves are so obsessed or hyperfixated on their own, and most likely also have their own disordered eating or eating disorder behaviors, that the child is then witnessing that and kind of absorbing some of these tendencies. We also sort of see it sort of in both ways and on both extremes, meaning that there might be a hyperfixation on someone being thin and that being idealized, but also the reverse, especially in childhood. There are many cultures that value a child being sort of thicker, or even use the terms like, oh, it's better when you're fat and healthy. And so it gets confusing, you know, if their own culture is then in direct conflict with maybe some of the mainstream sort of Hollywood idealized bodies. And then one person can get confused and fall somewhere in the middle. Those are sort of some of the environmental things. There's also like the physical body itself and sort of different barriers that come up in childhood if there's allergies, or I have worked with people that have structural issues with their gastrointestinal tract, or again, more of a IBS picture or something like that, that creates this inherent fear of food. And so while it may not have come from an aesthetic drive or a desire to look any certain way, suddenly they have this sort of disrupted relationship with their body and with their food, and a distrust of those things. So then that breeds an eating disorder. And so we actually see that a lot, where there's this chicken or egg cycle of, is there an eating disorder coming from a gastrointestinal issue early on, or are some of these gastrointestinal issues that we see a lot in eating disorders coming from the disordered eating itself? So there's a lot of, as you know, but counseling that goes into kind of learning history and sort of where did these things start and kind of come from. So yeah, there's so many different areas. I'm sure I've missed some, but that can contribute to somebody developing an eating disorder, and also when that trigger happens. So sometimes, again, the groundwork's been laid, but there's not actually a triggering event until, say, high school or college, which is when we see them sort of flourishing. Not that it's a positive thing, but we start to see them happen more often. And maybe there's, you know, a close friend, or especially in athletics, something, you know, culturally in athletics going on that shifts somebody's focus more towards weight or their body or their performance. So there's really just unfortunately, countless ways that these sort of behaviors creep into someone's life and then can turn into a full-blown eating disorder and sort of take over that way.
Yeah. Oh, that was so comprehensive, first of all, but so accurate too. Like I'm thinking about myself and the people that I know and the clients that I've worked with, of like, it was always there, and then all of a sudden one thing set it off, and it's like, oh, I never used to worry about that back then, and all of a sudden it's all I can think about.
Yeah. And the pandemic did that, like in broad strokes. So people did that, like that happened already pre-pandemic in people's lives. But then we just saw, I know, in the psychological side of things, and then certainly in nutrition, just unfortunately, this explosion of triggered and re-triggered, even if they knew about it and they were in recovery, disordered eating and eating disorders, because I mean, for obvious reasons, the world kind of shut down, and it gave this opportunity, unfortunately, for kind of really reflecting in and then really noticing some of these things too. So yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from the mental health side, I know a lot of times we think about control too, right? Like, what can I control in my life when everything else feels out of control? And with the pandemic, it was like mass feelings of just being out of control.
Yeah. And we'll see whole eating disorders that are emotionally driven that way. So people that don't have any desire, I think, for the sort of lay person that doesn't understand eating disorders, it's sort of this classic idea that it's, you know, the person that's very frail and definitely desires to be thin and wants to see the lower number on the scale and tracks every calorie. And while that exists, that's kind of a minority. The majority is people that present normal weight or even in larger bodies, and they are struggling inside, and they may not even care what the number on the scale says. That would be great, because nor do I, but there's so much more to it. And often it can just be literally that control piece of like trying to have some semblance of control in their life. And then back to our population being a student population and graduate level students, that's kind of one of the only areas they have control. So it makes sense.
Right. Oh my goodness. If you take one thing from this podcast episode, that's it. and it doesn't look the way that everyone defaults to thinking it looks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So having given all of this wonderful information, obviously this is just a short snapshot into this topic, where can I start to learn more about recovery, nutrition, and repairing my relationship with food and or body?
Yes, so this one is important because I think what happens is this is a inherently isolating mental illness is what we really should be calling it. And so they are literally experiencing all of these things, but also inherently part of it is that they are meant to feel, often I'll talk with the clients about how it's like this other voice in their head, this other almost side of themselves that's bullying them. And so they are made to feel victimized and belittled in their own bodies, like their problems aren't worth discussing. So it's really tough to ask for help because they don't feel like they can. But it's unlike, my foot hurts and you start Googling WebMD, what could be wrong? You can really get into some scary territory if you Google eating disorders, and you can even find, unfortunately, blog posts and things of people who are actively in eating disorder and unknowingly, and I'm sure it's not their goal to do this, but they're sort of putting out roadmaps for people to follow to be a more severe case of eating disorder. And I've actually worked with people that have gone down that rabbit hole, again, knowing that it's not even necessarily helpful, but just not able to help themselves because it's validating these problematic behaviors further. So that said, there's definitely some resources, some validated resources, some educational resources out there that really break down the various disorders, the criteria for what would classify them as having one. Again, some of what I started with, they'll break down sort of what's that difference between disordered eating and eating disorders. So some of these websites, which I'll share with you to link later, are really, really helpful. There's also, I'm spacing I think it's Eating Disorders Anonymous. There's also sub ones that I've had people love them and hate them. So that's obviously just one opportunity, but some people aren't ready or don't have access to work specifically with somebody on their disorder themselves, and they don't really want to maybe, and they want to kind of hear other people's stories first. So that might be a nice first step for them too. I would caution people on just jumping right into their own cultivation of like recovery stories on social media, because that again can be a slippery slope. Although I have, after working for a long time with a client, sort of helped them decide if something is actually helping them or not, because there are some great accounts out there that people can feel like they're on a journey with somebody helpful, but it's tricky because you can totally get re-triggered, and just one sentence that might be meaningful to one person could actually send someone else off the mental health cliff that they're on. So yeah, it's a tricky area as far as like self-exploration, but the biggest recommendation, if someone has access, and certainly at UOP, that's one of the beauties of the wellness fee, is that they have unlimited access to psychological services and nutrition services, is to actually ask for those appointments and get help right away, because then it's catered to their specific recovery journey, and it's not like just trying to pull bits and pieces from something on a website.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm so glad that you didn't sort of orient towards some of the things that are coming up with like following body positive Instagram accounts, right? Like inherently it makes sense. It's wonderful. It can be helpful. And just like you said, there can be one sentence, one word, one image that suddenly just triggers you or sets, it just feels like too much. And I think when we're desperate for relief, it's like just kind of clawing and hoarding whatever we can, which if that doesn't reflect part of the eating disorder mentality, I don't know what does.
Yeah, definitely.
It shows up in so many different worlds. So I love that. I will definitely link to all those resources. And if anyone doesn't know this, psychological services, that's CAPS, that's us, therapists, and then nutrition services, that's Charlotte, literally. She's a dietitian on campus. She's fantastic. Moving on. Okay, so we're rolling through. What are some of the most common barriers in your experience that students run into when it comes to seeking help and reaching out for these struggles?
So the biggest one first is logistics. So they are busy students. And again, UOP has 3 different campuses, multiple programs, graduate level programs, doctoral level programs, the undergrad campus. It's got a lot of variety in student body. And so they're busy, and there's not always, as far as, you guys in CAPS, you're only so many people. And so trying to get in with that, it can be a barrier. And then with nutrition counseling specifically, even just inherently in my title, registered dietitian, sounds scary and cold and like it's going to be diet focused, which is inherently problematic. So sometimes it's just a barrier of logistics or just getting cold feet and things that really make sense. This is really hard topic to talk about when you're struggling with it. Like I said earlier, it's a inherently isolating place to be. And so to even decide to seek help is hard. And then when you add in class schedules and trying to match that against the professional's work schedules, sometimes you can't even find the time to make it work. So that's one of the biggest barriers that is ongoing. And I think that's something that we do a great job of trying to accommodate. I know I've literally changed my hours multiple times to try to see if I can target more people. And then I certainly am flexible with people's schedules as much as I can be. So that's one piece. And then the other one that I see come up a lot, or what if I ask somebody, what made you wait so long to schedule, if you've been thinking about this for so long, just because I'm curious, what some of these barriers are. This very question has come up many times. And it's, again, inherently part of this disorder is often that they are perfectionistic in mindset, they have high anxiety, and so they just never feel like they're sick enough or that their problems are worth sort of quote unquote complaining about, when in fact, obviously they are, and they deserve this help. And the biggest thing in that first session, and I think this is true for CAPS as well, is to really communicate that it's not a choice and it's not their fault, but they don't inherently know that until they show up for a session. So that's the biggest sort of psychological hurdle to get over, is this idea of, do I deserve help? Am I allowed to ask for help? Is this even a problem? Like, I'm just trying to be healthy. Isn't everybody trying to be healthy? This isn't an issue. But if you're obsessing about food all day and constantly on diets and all these things that are actually signs of disordered eating, yes, you are, sick enough, whatever that even means. You can always show up and sort of ask for some objective help. So those are the two biggest barriers that I've identified for people seeking help.
Yeah, another big takeaway, if you want the cliff notes of this conversation we're having, is, yeah, even if it doesn't look a certain way, right? That like skinny near death Netflix looking experience, it's still really important and really hard and concerning.
Yeah.
So, shout out to you for recognizing that. I mean, all the things. So, this question that I'm about to ask you, I think is really cool. It's a little difficult too. And I want to just give a little disclaimer about that, because I don't want anyone to feel like they're on blast in this way, but I'm wondering, especially as a mental health professional who's passionate about this topic, what are some things that people might be doing or saying on a daily basis that aren't helping either themselves or people around them who may be struggling with these issues?
Yeah. So the biggest thing, and I like the way that we're coming at this, because sometimes it's literally the way somebody's thinking, but it's also, you're not realizing if you are speaking up about food or body, even if you're inherently only speaking about yourself in front of other people, that it's influencing other people. And we talked a little bit about that earlier with the example of a parent who might be modeling certain behaviors. So some of the big ones to kind of pick up on, or again, I even just to rephrase this a little bit, like if you're wondering, why am I so triggered by my friend saying this and that, this is probably why, because you're already having some inherent thoughts around food or your body, and then somebody's sort of validating them inappropriately around you. So the big one is labeling foods as good or bad. That's a big one. Food does not possess morality. So it's food, it's edible, and it's hopefully enjoyable. And sometimes it's emotional, and that's okay. I think that's another big one that people think is, if it's feeling emotional, then it's somehow wrong. And that's not at all true. Now, of course, when it becomes pathological and we're emotionally running from something else, then we might turn to a comfort food and even dissociate and do what we call binge eating. And again, inherently, that's not a choice. And it's also not about the food. So the food isn't the good or bad thing here. It's this idea of what else is going on underneath. So just to be very clear, it's when people or yourself, if you catch yourself labeling things as good or bad, oh, that's bad for me. Oh, I can't believe I ate that. That was so wrong. then we have to look at where's that coming from? Is that something that, you learned as a child? Was that instilled from a teacher, or did you hear it from, certainly there are dietitians that unfortunately are pushing that out on people. So it's this idea of, yes, different food can offer different things. And some of those things might be nutritional, and some of those things might be emotional, and some of those things might just be purely a flavor explosion party in your mouth, and that's great. So there's different reasons we eat food, but they're not inherently, these food products are not good or bad. So that's one. And then the other one that comes up, I think, most frequently second to that is this notion of deserving to eat or deserving to honor hunger signals. And that's usually tied into some sort of like exercise component. So people feel like, well, I didn't get to exercise today, so I probably shouldn't even eat dinner. And so that's a big one that I end up educating people around, is this notion of, even if you were in a coma in the hospital, we provide a tube down your throat or a IV line into your arm to provide most of the calories that you need in the day. So a lot of that is just misinformation, or unfortunately this calorie in, calorie out thing that's pushed out there as far as weight loss goes. And so people literally think, oh, well, I have to only eat as much as I can pump out, which is just not true in the way that they're understanding it.
Right.
And so we need a substantial amount of our calories for the day just to exist as a human. And so the exercise has actually very little to do with any kind of additional or subtractional calorie needs for the day. And often it doesn't have anything to do with that 24-hour period. It actually is more of a culmination of different days and a whole bunch of more nuanced discussion that I would have on a case-by-case basis. But that signal of like, oh, I can't, or oh, am I gonna have to work out tomorrow? I'm gonna have to run extra tomorrow after this meal. That inherently, I got to work it off. That is inherently like sort of a problematic way of thinking, or a little bit of a red flag of like, okay, something's going on here. So that's another one. Another one to look out for is comparing yourself or watching other people overly compare themselves, whether it's in body, or even a big one is how much somebody else is eating. So if they're like, well, I finished mine and they didn't finish theirs, there's no way that you can know the entirety of what that other person has eaten that day, has eaten that week, what their genetics look like, what they need. There's no comparison. The closest we might get to that is if you have an identical twin. And even then we know from enough studies that you may actually require different things if you're, again, different in your day-to-day life and doings. So that is another one that is really harmful to yourself for obvious reasons, to be comparing constantly, but as a sign that there might be something going on if you find yourself or someone else kind of constantly comparing in those areas. So that's another one. Check in some notes here to make sure that I'm getting everything. Oh, so then maybe what might seem a more obvious sort of red flag items, but some of these might be done more privately. So this would be more of that self-focus, like what are some of the behaviors I'm doing? If you find that, constant weighing is a big one. There's really so little utility to classic scales. So I certainly don't use them in my work unless we're really worried on a medical level for somebody, which is very rare. Like that is an extreme case. And if we are going to use a scale, it's going to be a blind weight, and it's going to be pretty infrequent even then. It's never going to be daily. So the daily weight thing is a problem for sure. And that's a whole nother discussion in itself. So that those people that have worked with me know that I go on my scale rant. I have a few rants, and sometimes they last 20 whole minutes. So that's, more on that if you want, sign up for an appointment. But the idea of that is just the red flag behavior. So weighing yourself. Another one is if you find yourself constantly checking in the mirror, or even just looking down and sort of, I have people that do these, even if they didn't realize it till we talked about it for the first time, putting their hands around their various parts of their legs or arms to make sure things are fitting into the size that, they quote unquote should be. Little body checks like that. There's lots of variations on what that looks like, but if someone's doing that a lot, then that's a red flag that there's a problem going on, some sort of disordered eating. I think those are the big sort of areas to.
Yeah, those are great and so helpful. I'm thinking about, once again, myself, when I started my recovery, I was in college, I was in my undergrad, and I didn't know any of that. I had no idea, just the things I was saying or the things I was hearing, how they were impacting people around me and myself. And that's obviously such a big statement for life.
Mm-hmm.
Our hope as we talk about this in this platform is to help y'all as students, help people in general, just recognize that sometimes the language we use maybe isn't what we mean for it to be, but we don't know until we know.
Right.
And, important disclaimer for anyone listening to this, if you know someone who is doing a body check or is talking about good and bad with food, those specific items don't mean that they have an eating disorder.
Correct.
This is such a whole person, whole situation experience. And I think it can be easy to sort of self-diagnose in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And also, if this is something that you struggle with the way that I did and still can sometimes struggle with, you're in the right place.
Exactly. Yes, I'm glad you made that distinction. And certainly, yeah, it's a tough thing if you're close to someone exhibiting some of these behaviors, because it's a coping strategy that you're witnessing and they don't even notice that they're exhibiting these things. And it's tricky to call it out. They can feel really isolated suddenly or bad, or again, some of these words that are already a problem. So yeah, it can be tricky, but it does help to learn what they are and maybe have some insight into, oh, that might be why, my friend is talking in this way, and sort of even just being there with that knowledge, even not addressing it, can be so helpful to try to just be a support person for that. But certainly if you're feeling any of these things that we talked about as a student, again, this is hopefully validating back to that question of what's a big barrier, that you are definitely not alone and that these are problematic thoughts, even if you're not even taking action on them yet. You can get in on this quicker and not let it kind of get out of hand.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That's the beauty of the work that we do, Charlotte, is like,
Yes.
you don't have to be suffering to want to be happier. Like
Exactly. Please don't wait until you're suffering.
Yeah.
That's so much harder to dig out of. It's possible for sure, but gosh, if you can get in on it sooner, what a gift you give yourself if you could do that.
So true. All right. So last question as we wrap up, since we're just trucking along. What is some words of wisdom or some advice that you would give to anyone who is struggling or knows someone who is struggling with eating disorder or disordered eating, as we've been talking about?
Yeah, so we this kind of nicely rolls off from the last one, where you do have to be a little cautious with addressing it if it's somebody close to you. Like even if it's a family member, it can really be tricky, especially, there's so many different family dynamics. And, again, when we talked originally in the beginning of this about cultural differences and whether or not you can address those things within someone's culture or background. So just being careful with that. Certainly, if you're really close with someone and you feel confident that you can let them know about the services, especially if you're a UOP student and so are they, and they can reach out for help. Even something as simple as that. But again, back to your point, Lacey, like don't be self-diagnosing or diagnosing out there, because that can actually breed resentment and kind of insert itself into the relationship, with your friend, with your partner, whoever you're worried about. But yeah, kind of understanding these things a little bit more. If you don't feel like you're suffering, but you're sort of very close to somebody that is kind of showing up for them and being that support, and honestly, just trying to keep up some healthy boundaries, because it really can be draining and difficult to be around somebody who's suffering, especially untreated. So that's sort of one insight. And then certainly, hopefully it's been made clear in our conversation today that if you yourself are hearing this and are experiencing any number of these sort of thought patterns or behavioral patterns that we've touched on and discussed, and as we just joked about earlier, like really, if you can do yourself the service to get in sooner, it is reversible, even at the most extreme side of it. Yes, it could take years if you're fully, enveloped in a eating disorder for, many, many months or years. It's going to take some time to rewire, reframe, like we just talked about for this whole time. This is a mental health condition. And so that means that quite literally, the brain is firing in a way that is not supporting you to live a normal, happy life. And so we can do a lot of work, obviously in traditional therapy and therapeutic settings. And then in my role as the dietitian, we do some of that specific to food and sort of creating structural plans to see if we can create a space to have what is food freedom and to learn what is intuitively eating and be more mindful instead of mindless and sort of escaping some of these invasive thoughts and things that lead to these disordered eating habits. So yeah, the biggest recommendation, if you're exhibiting any of these behaviors or feeling these things, is to just get help as soon as possible. Don't doubt, again, that you don't have a severe enough case or that you don't even know if you have a case. I would argue 85 to 90% of people that come in initially may have been referred because one of you or your colleagues has flagged them as someone that might be at risk for eating disorder. And so it's not even known until the conversation is had. And again, we're not doing these conversations to label people, but it is, like you said, sometimes liberating to go, oh, okay, I'm not the only person in this world feeling this way. And then we can start the process and the journey of recovery, because it is a process, but it's one that is, each time you show up for an appointment, just another opportunity for that freedom, which is just so much better than living in sort of the prison that is the eating disorder framework.
So true. I'll just see that on a poster, please. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Part of my hope with this conversation we're having is to have something that students can watch or hear or whatever and see you, like who you are. Because as a clinician at CAPS, I mean, you're right. I am constantly thinking, okay, would this person benefit from working with Charlotte? And so often students are like, who's Charlotte?
Yeah.
I'm like, so I'm grateful that you've taken the time to share all of your knowledge and your expertise. And it's so clear that you are amazing at what you do. And you're such an important part of the campus, which is awesome. And I think
appreciate
that's
that.
it. Oh no. Oh, I lost you. Oh, you're back.
Oh no, where's the end? I was saying I appreciate that. Kind words, but it's definitely a strong team of I represent solely, unfortunately, the only part of nutrition, but with myself and CAPS, that's such an amazing service that these students have of support. And I would say almost every single one would agree to that, that's actually gone through and really challenged their disorder with this sort of support team effort. And I don't think anyone's ever regretted asking for that first step. So yes, if you feel the need, come on in.
Of course. Okay, thank you.